The first thing I want to say is to suggest that we need to understand that there's been a subtle but very profound change in the context in which the question is being asked today. In summary, I'd want to put to you that there's been a counterproductive move to adopt a naive view that the purely pragmatic approach to resolving human problems will always work. And we've heard a few examples of that sort of sentiment at work at the moment. In the lead up to the election of the Rudd government and the giving of the apology, the former government tried to make much of the notion of practical reconciliation, thinking that facts being changed on the ground would undo all of the damage which had preceded. Similarly, since the time of the NT intervention with things like compulsory income management, we see a technical response to human problems, but a limited approach that fails to take into account the complexities of the human spirit. Now, that is the particular symptom. What I want to suggest to you is that there's something deeper that we need to address. And there are three elements to that I want to touch on briefly before getting into some of the more specific issues for the sector. The first of these issues is the way in which there's been a progressive change over time, and I'm talking about quite a long time now, to move away from looking at the depth of things to dealing only with the surface of things. Secondly, I want to argue that we are all in the midst of what I would describe as a long age of forgetting, and that this has implications on the way in which we relate to the problems we encounter. And thirdly, and perhaps most profoundly of all, I want to suggest to you that as we have this debate, we're doing so in a context in which there has been a significant loss of confidence in the language of ethics. It's becoming harder and harder even to have conversations about why we ought to do the things we do, because that language has largely been displaced by the discourse of economics. So I'll touch on each of those things. Some years ago, I was lucky enough to be in an audience where the great Italian author Umberto Eco was speaking, and he made the point that he thought we should distinguish between the ancient world and the modern world, because whereas the ancient world was populated by heroes, our modern world had to suffice with celebrities. And the difference, he said, was that the ancient world with its heroes was a world in which there was depth. The character of a person mattered as much as what they looked like or what they did, whereas the world of celebrities was a world of glittering surfaces, where as long as you looked good or had the latest appliance or gadget or whatever, then you would be celebrated. Now, it reminded me that in the ancient Greek, and I don't know a lot of ancient Greek, the word for honour, kalos, was the same word that they used for beauty, and the word for ugliness, aishron, was the same word they used for shame. There really was a sense in which people's character mattered when we made an assessment of even an aesthetic quality. But this world of shallow world in which we're living at the moment, you see the signs of it all around us. You see it, for example, in the reliance by most political parties on opinion polls and the short-term direction that gives to policy. You see it in the pervasive influence of the shock jocks, where a human headline, can suddenly change the tone of debate. You see it in the 24-hour news cycles and the use of sound bites. I mean, the most ridiculous thing I heard the other day was an interview where they said, and the minister for such and such commented, and you heard the minister say, "I agree," or something like that. It was, it was literally just a second's worth just to fill a gap. And then we also see it even in the way that we engage as citizens in our own increasingly narrow focus on segments of the news which just happen to suit our existing prejudices. One of the great things about the old print newspapers, which are under some threat now, is that you bump into stories that you might never have looked for. You can explore a bit more. Whereas now, if you only read what you like to read online, you're more likely than not to self-select. So the first thing I want to suggest to you about the context in which this sector needs to think about how it's going to challenge inequality is that it needs to contend with the fact that so much of what we deal with is just at the level of the surface. The second thing I want to suggest is that we're in the midst of a long age of forgetting. Now, what I mean by this is that if you look at virtually all of the institutions which exist around us today, whether you look at churches or universities or organisations represented in this room, many of them have been around for a very long time, and many of them were inspired in terms of their initial foundation by some deep human insight. It might have been an instance of injustice which prompted people to act. It could have been some very basic human need which was recognised, and somewhere in the past somebody had one of those aha moments that Jung talks about, a thing where it's all so clear, which then becomes a motive for action. And the trouble is that so often, once those moments have passed, the formation of institutions sees creation of doctrines and dogmas and institutional arrangements and systems and policies and structures and buildings, a whole series of things which become fascinating in their own right, while the essential purpose for which the institution was initially founded is forgotten. It recedes into the background. People forget the purpose for which things were initially established because all of the paraphernalia of the system becomes fascinating in its own right. And what you start to see happen when that occurs is that institutions, without ever intending to do so, begin to betray the things that they say that they actually believe in. And this is happening all around us. You can go into institutions of almost any kind and probe people. Why do you do the things you do? Oh, because everybody does it like that. Because that's just the way we do things around here. The ability to connect current day conduct back to some defining purpose, which is still alive, which is still invested with meaning, well, that's sort of receded during the course of this long age of forgetting. I suggest that that's something we all need to think about and worry about. It's not to be pessimistic about this, as if there's some inevitable decline. Rather, I'm optimistic generally that if we wanted to, we could have fresh conversations about the purposes of the institutions which exist in society or to which we belong. And although it's possible that the answers that we might discern for their purpose are the same as those original ones, the difference might be that for the first time, perhaps in centuries in some cases, those answers would be ours. They'd be invested with a kind of life. But again, standing against that possibility is a blockage. And that's the third of the things I mentioned, which is a loss of confidence in even the language that we could use to take us back to something authentic. Let me give you 3 examples of what's been happening. Many of you will remember some years ago there was a debate about whether or not to introduce into Central Australian communities opal fuel, which was a substitute for the normal volatile fuel which was being used by young people in communities around Uluru and other places, where they were sniffing the petrol and they were destroying their health and often destroying their lives. There was a technical solution that somebody had developed new fuel, and it would have been very easy, you would have thought, to say, here's a terrible problem, blighting the lives of these young people, destroying the futures of these communities. Here is a way to prevent it. Surely we ought to do so. But no, the policy was only changed after Access Economics was commissioned to produce a report showing that economically it would cost less to bring in the fuel than to allow these injuries to continue. And so, with the blessing of the economics report, opal fuel was introduced into these communities. The environmental movement some years ago gave up, if you like, in the debate about climate change, any direct reference to the value of other species or notions of stewardship or the idea, and occasionally you get it mentioned now, about a duty to future generations. Instead, the principal argument that was adopted was the one that, in fact, Bob Brown was speaking in part of this morning, Lord Nicholas Stern's famous report, showing that if we didn't deal with climate change, in the long run, it would cost us all too much. In other words, economics solved the problem for us. And perhaps most troubling of all was that in 2008, in November of 2008, two charitable organisations established to try and combat the evils of child abuse again felt it necessary to go to Access Economics to commission a report to show that child abuse costs too much.